To protest far right.
When they said I'm black and I'm proud, that meant something.
It was the age of selfishness. It was the age of self-indulgence. It was the age of anti-authority.
It was absolutely exhilarating. It was the greatest time to be alive, ever, for sure.
The 60s was the last idealistic time.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, something happened to a generation of young Americans that would mark them forever. It is a story of war, the struggle for racial equality, and the explosion of a counterculture. It was a time when a generation rebelled and lost its innocence. It seemed that the time for racial equality in America had finally come.
Because of a woman named Rosa Parks and a bunch of college kids who sat down at a Woolworth luncheon counter in 1960, and of course Martin Luther King, who was surely the most important American in the 20th century. It was their declaration that the world was going to change and that white men were no longer going to control everything in America and that everyone was finally going to be treated equally. It was their example which made everything else possible.
Millions of young Americans had grown up in an era of unparalleled affluence. But here they were denouncing materialism, competition, and conformity, the very values that had paved the way for that affluence. It was also an era of sexual freedom, ushered in by the birth control pill, long before the emergence of AIDS. Marriage and monogamy seemed passé.
Over a period of less than a year, you had people who were calm, respectable, responsible Negroes, all of a sudden militants wearing dashikis with huge afros, taking Swahili class, identifying with the homeland. There is nothing more exhilarating or seductive than a change in consciousness. And in the 1960s, blacks made a transition, especially on the college campus, from being Negroes to being black to being Afro-Americans. When they said I'm black and I'm proud, that meant something.
At the end of March in Memphis, Tennessee, garbage workers who were mostly black and grossly underpaid were out on strike.
These men who were really at the low rung on the totem pole just got tired of being treated less than men. And if you notice that sign they had, it didn't say peace, it didn't say freedom, it didn't say justice. All it said was, I am a man.
Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly.
Martin Luther King, the nation's preeminent civil rights leader, came to Memphis to express moral support for the men on strike.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
There was a group of young guys called the Invaders, some of whom were on the FBI's payroll. We didn't know that at the time. But they were there really to stir up trouble. These young guys had taken the sticks off of the placards, started breaking out windows, and they started the riot. And you know, once you start, everybody gets in it. And rather than try and isolate the people who were rioting, the police just waded into the crowd, just beating people indiscriminately, just beating them. It was horrible. Martin was taken up physically, put in a car, and taken to the closest hotel for his own safety.
Luther King was at a crossroads. Despite doubts, despite death threats, he refused to turn back. On the night of April 3rd, he appeared before a packed congregation at Mason Temple.
It was thundering and lightning, and the rain was coming hard. And Martin didn't take a text. We called it the mountaintop speech. He just started speaking extemporaneously. And I'd not heard him, of all the times I'd heard him speak, I'd not heard him like this.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Of his fear, that I no longer fear death. He always said he would not live to be 40. He didn't think he would. He wanted to, but he never thought he'd live to be 40 years old. He was 39 when he was killed.
There were so many people being picked up, so many people being killed, that they were literally hauling out corpses in fishnets under helicopters like they did in Vietnam, because they did not want mass funerals and so forth, either just prior to and most certainly not during the Olympic Games.
The world heard very little about the student massacre, but no one missed the Black Power protests at the Olympics by American sprinters Tommie Smith and John Carlos.
Smith and Carlos' demonstration was not anti-American. It was pro-human rights, and most specifically pro-black rights. People either wept and cheered, or they were outraged to the rafters.
Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Olympics, but their Black Power salute became one of the most provocative and enduring images of 1968.
This experience, which Black Americans were having, did not go unnoticed by the rest of America. Something had started that was beginning to spread, a new kind of pride, identity, and consciousness that was about to turn the mass movements of the 1960s into new and different forms of activism.
Now, we fought the public accommodations fight 10 years ago with the blacks. Are we going to have to start all over again with women?
How about, would you like a sign up there that said blacks only or whites only? It's the same principle, sir. Women are persons, women are people. And we want to be able to come and go through it, and we don't want to be intimidated by signs that say men's buffet.
I have no intentions of taking the sign down or changing the sign. If you can get a court order to take it down, fine.
You have no intention of changing your policy of segregated facilities. Is that correct, sir?
If you women are that hard up for a glass of beer, I'll be glad to serve you at the bar.
In 1970, America was still very much a man's world. More women than ever were joining the workforce, but at the same time, they were still expected to be the traditional housewives and mothers of a generation earlier. In some states, women could not obtain credit cards or mortgages without a male cosigner, and nationally, they were paid an average of 59 cents for every dollar a man earned. In short, American women were still second-class citizens.
You know, sometimes the events of decades can crystallize in a moment, and it seems as if overnight there's this historic change. When you look back at it, you say, oh, well, this was building up, and for years there was this person and this person and this group, and they were networking and this, and then there was a shift. The women's movement had many origins. In part, it owes its renewed birth to the civil rights movement.
It's hard for a kid growing up now to realize that in 1964, 5, 6, whenever, if a woman sat on a park bench reading a book, chances were she would be interrupted, and that the man who came up to her would assume that she would rather talk to him than read the book. If two women were in a restaurant eating together, it was common for a man or a couple of men to come up to them and assume that they were there to be talked to and that they weren't there for any purpose of themselves. It's hard to believe that this happened, because it doesn't, and that really has changed. I mean,